If your idea of world history begins with Rome, Egypt, or Greece, then lift your eyes to the spaces between those familiar names, the vast, wind-beaten lands where empires rose without marble, and power left no columns behind. There was once a force that stretched from the Pacific to the edges of Europe, swallowing kingdoms, shattering borders, and redrawing the known world at a speed no civilization had ever seen. And yet, unlike the great powers remembered in stone, this one seemed to vanish into open sky. No grand palaces remain. No monumental tombs stand over its rulers. Only silent distance and a name that still echoes across the centuries, the Mongol Empire. It began not in a walled city, but on the steppe, on a horizon so wide it seems to dissolve the line between earth and heaven. From that emptiness came riders who moved like a storm, and one man whose will would change the fate of continents. His empire transformed history. His grave was never found, and in Mongolia his shadow is still everywhere, Genghis Khan. Before Mongolia became a power that terrified continents, it was a land of fractured tribes, bitter winters, and constant struggle. Alliances changed quickly. Loyalty was fragile. Survival depended on horses, animals, and the strength to endure one hard season after another. Out of that world came a man named Temujin. He was not born into comfort or security. His early life was marked by loss, hunger, and betrayal. But those experiences hardened him. Over time, he proved himself not only as a fighter, but as a leader who understood people discipline and fear. He did not inherit a united nation. He created one. By defeating rival clans, building new loyalties, and rewarding merit over bloodline, Temujin transformed the political map of the steppe. When he became Genghis Khan, Mongolia was no longer a loose collection of tribes. It had become a single force. From there, the expansion was relentless. His armies moved with speed, coordination, and precision that shocked the settled world. Cities fell. Trade routes changed. Entire kingdoms were forced to reckon with a new kind of power coming out of the grasslands. And yet, for all that scale, the man himself remains strangely elusive. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but the details of his burial were hidden so completely that no confirmed tomb has ever been found. According to the long-standing accounts, the funeral procession was kept secret, and anyone who crossed its path was killed. The men who buried him were said to have been silenced as well. Whether every detail is true or not, the result is undeniable. The greatest conqueror of the steppe left no public grave, no great mausoleum, no final monument. That absence matters. It is part of why he still feels larger than history, present everywhere, and yet physically nowhere. Tsonjin Boldog, where destiny took shape. East of Ulaanbaatar, beyond the traffic apartment blocks and smoke of the capital, the land begins to open. The road runs out into wide grassland, and the horizon starts to feel bigger than the journey itself. About 54 kilometers from the city near the Tool River lies Tsonjin Boldog, a place tied to one of Mongolia's most enduring legends. According to local tradition, this is where the young Temujin found a golden whip, a sign that heaven had marked him for something greater. Whether taken as history or legend, the story matters because Mongolians do not see this place as just another stop outside the capital. They see it as a landscape connected to the beginning of national destiny. That sense of destiny is written into the monument that now dominates the site. Rising from the steppe in polished stainless steel, the Chinggis Khaan equestrian statue stands 40 meters tall, or 50 meters if you include its base, and it is recognized by Guinness as the largest equestrian statue in the world. It was opened in 2008, built as a modern tribute to the founder of the Mongol Empire, and placed where the grassland still feels broad enough to match the scale of the man it honors. From a distance, the statue appears almost unreal. The horse is still the rider upright, the metal surface catching light differently as clouds move overhead. In the clear morning, it can look cold and silver. By late afternoon, it reflects warmer tones from the surrounding plain. Up close, the monument becomes more than a statue. The circular base is wrapped with 36 columns representing the line of great Khans from Chinggis to Ligdan, and inside the complex are exhibition spaces, visitor facilities, and access to one of the most memorable viewpoints near Ulaanbaatar. Visitors can move up through the structure and walk toward the horse's head, where the viewing platform opens across the surrounding steppe. From there, the landscape explains why this setting matters. there are no walls to frame it, no dense skyline to interrupt it, only open ground, distant ridges, and the feeling that power here once moved on horseback rather than from behind stone fortifications. And that is what makes Tsonjin Boldog such a strong beginning for this journey through Mongolia. It is not simply a monument to a famous ruler. It is a meeting point between legend and nationhood, between the memory of Temujin and the Mongolia of today. Before we enter the capital, the monasteries, the lakes and the desert, this is where the story first stands, still long enough for us to see it clearly. One man, one horse, and the open land that shaped both. Ulaanbaatar, where the steppe meets the modern state. After the open grasslands of Tsonjin Boldog, Ulaanbaatar feels like Mongolia gathered into one basin. The capital sits on the Tool River at about 1,350 meters above sea level, and it is widely described as one of the coldest capital cities in the world. It is also the country's undisputed center of gravity, home to a huge share of Mongolia's population, and the place where political power, business, migration, and memory all meet. This is not a city that replaced the steppe. It is a city still negotiating with it every day. At the center of that negotiation is Ulaanbaatar Square. This is the formal heart of the capital, a broad civic space anchored by the equestrian statue of Damdin Ulaanbaatar, the revolutionary figure closely tied to Mongolia's 1921 independence movement. On the north side stands the government palace, and in front of it, the image of Genghis Khan now dominates the national stage with imperial symbolism placed directly at the center of modern state architecture. In one frame, you can read Mongolia's public identity. Very clearly, revolution, statehood, and empire standing side by side. But the deeper story of Ulaanbaatar is not written only in monuments. It spreads across the hills in the Györ districts, where hundreds of thousands of residents live beyond the apartment core. Many families arrived from the countryside over years of economic change and harsh Zuu winters when extreme cold and heavy snow-killed livestock have pushed even more herders toward the capital. In these districts, people still rely heavily on coal-burning stoves for heat through the long winter. And that is one of the main reasons Ulaanbaatar's air becomes so dangerous in the cold season. The city's sharpest contradiction is here traditional resilience on one side and a major public health crisis on the other. To understand the city fully, you have to climb above it. On the southern hillside, the Soviet-era Zaysan Memorial looks out over Ulaanbaatar, commemorating Mongolian and Soviet war dead, while offering one of the clearest views of the capital's layout. From there you can see the dense apartment blocks, the river corridor, and the Györ districts stretching outward. Then, not far away, the Bogd Khan Winter Palace tells a very different story. Once the winter residence of Mongolia's last theocratic ruler, it survives as one of the country's most important historical museums, preserving a layer of royal and Buddhist Mongolia that predates the socialist city around it. And that is what makes Ulaanbaatar so important to this journey. It is not just Mongolia's capital. It is the place where old authority, modern pressure, and national memory all remain visible at once. Before we move back out into lakes monasteries and the wider steppe, this city shows us the country in compressed form, ambitious, burdened, resilient, and still deeply shaped by the land beyond its streets. Lake Khövsgöl, the blue silence of the north. Far to the north, where Mongolia begins to lean toward Siberia, the landscape changes again. The city falls away. The air sharpens. Forest replaces open steppe. And then, almost suddenly, the land opens onto Lake Khövsgöl, a body of water so large and so clear that it feels less like a lake than a separate world. This is Mongolia's largest freshwater lake. By volume, the country's deepest and clearest, lying near the Russian border at more than 1,600 meters above sea level. It stretches for about 136 kilometers, reaches a maximum depth of roughly 262 meters, and holds the majority of Mongolia's freshwater. Hydrologically, it also belongs to the greater Lake Baikal basin through the Erdene and Selenge river system. What makes Khövsgöl so striking is not only its scale, but its setting. The lake sits within a region of taiga mountains, wetlands, and forest, steppe and northern environment that feels very different from the Mongolia many people imagine. UNESCO's Biosphere Reserve description notes that the surrounding landscape supports rare and threatened species, including reindeer, Siberian ibex, red deer, and even snow leopards in the wider reserve. Nearly 100 rivers and streams feed the lake, while only one river flows out, which helps explain the slow water exchange and the remarkable clarity people notice almost immediately at the shore. Locally, Khövsgöl is often called the Blue Pearl of Mongolia, and that title makes sense the moment you see it. In summer, the water can look intensely blue against the dark tree line and the pale ridges beyond. In winter, the lake freezes into a hard, glassy surface, and the world becomes quieter, wider, more exposed. Some local tourism sources note that the ice can reach around a meter thick by late November or winter season, turning the lake into one of the country's most dramatic cold weather landscapes. In a country where many lakes are saline, a freshwater lake of this size and clarity carries practical value, but it also carries emotional weight. That is one reason Khövsgöl is widely regarded as sacred. Shamanism, sacred sites, and the ovoo. In Mongolia, belief is not confined to temples or scriptures. It lives in the land itself, in mountain passes, river valleys, isolated peaks, and the open spaces where weather can change in minutes. Long before Buddhism took root on the steppe, Mongolian communities practiced forms of shamanism, centered on spirits' ancestry, and the unseen powers believed to inhabit the natural world. In that tradition, the landscape is not passive. A mountain can be sacred. A river can be protected by a spirit. A certain place can demand respect simply because of what is believed to dwell there. At the center of that world stands the shaman. In the broad history of Northern Asian shamanic traditions, a shaman is not usually understood as someone who simply chooses the role. He or she is believed to be called often through signs, illness visions, or spiritual pressure. The shaman's work is to communicate with forces beyond ordinary human reach, to heal, to interpret, to guide, and to negotiate with the spirit world. Trance is central to that role, and the drum is one of the most important instruments used to enter that altered state. Britannica describes shamanism as a religious phenomenon built around ecstatic experience, spirit communication, and ritual performance, rather than formal doctrine. What makes Mongolia especially distinctive is that these older practices did not simply disappear when Buddhism spread across the country. Instead, sacred site worship evolved through a long blending of traditions. UNESCO's documentation notes that the worship of sacred sites in Mongolia has roots closely linked to shamanism, and was later enriched by Buddhist rites from the 16th century onward. That fusion is still visible today, especially at mountain springs and ovoo stone, or wooden cairns, that function as ritual markers, shrines and points of contact between people and place. The ovoo is one of the clearest expressions of that relationship. You find them on ridgelines, at passes on hilltops, and beside roads where travellers stop almost instinctively. At many sites, the custom is to move clockwise around the cairn 3 times, adding a stone and leaving an offering, often milk, tea, dairy products or money, as a gesture of respect and a request for safe passage. These are not empty habits. They are acts of recognition, reminders that travel across Mongolia has long involved not just distance, but permission. That is why this part of Mongolia matters so much. To understand the country, you have to understand that its spiritual map is layered over the physical one. Here, belief is still tied to direction, elevation, weather, and memory. The sacred is not somewhere else. It is underfoot on the skyline and waiting at the next pass. Tsam, when the monastery becomes another world. There are moments in Mongolia when religion does not feel quiet at all. It arrives in sound. First the long cry of horns, the pulse of drums, the metallic clash of cymbals rolling through a monastery courtyard. Then come the figures themselves, monks in heavy robes, towering masks and layered costumes that turn the human body into something larger, stranger, and more commanding. This is Tsam, Mongolia's masked Buddhist ritual dance, and it was never meant to be understood as simple performance. It is ceremony, theology, discipline and spectacle moving together in one space. In Mongolian practice, the dancers appear as wrathful protectors, deities and symbolic beings from the world of Tibetan Buddhism, making sacred ideas visible through movement. What makes Tsam so powerful is the way it changes the atmosphere around it. A courtyard stops feeling like a courtyard. The air thickens with incense. The choreography slows time down. Every turn of the body, every stamped step, every raised sleeve carries intention. This is not dance for applause. It is dance as ritual action. The masks themselves were traditionally elaborate works, and surviving early 20th century examples preserved in museum collections show how much craftsmanship went into creating these spiritual identities. Tsam combines costume, music, choreography, and Buddhist teaching into one form, so even when a spectator does not understand every symbol, the experience still feels unmistakably sacred. And yet, like so much of Mongolia's religious life, Tsam was violently interrupted in the 20th century. Britannica notes that religious mysteries such as Tsam were banned during the anti-religious campaigns of the 1930s. UNESCO documentation for the Orkhon Valley goes even further, noting that in the early 20th century, around 500 temples and monasteries had their own local versions of the ceremony. After the purges, that living tradition was nearly broken. Much of what survived did so in fragments: stored costumes, preserved masks, written records, and memory. Later revivals brought the ritual back into public life, especially through monasteries in Ulaanbaatar and festival settings linked to Gandhan Tegchinlen Monastery. That history is part of what gives Tsam its force today. When you watch it in Mongolia, you are not simply watching a beautiful old custom. You are watching a tradition that was pushed almost to disappearance and still returned. The masks no longer feel like museum objects. The drums no longer feel like echoes. For a few minutes, the boundary between art and devotion falls away, and the old Buddhist imagination of Mongolia steps back into the visible world. And when the last movements end and the smoke begins to thin, the journey turns again away from the monastery and west toward the red cliffs and fossil beds of the Gobi. Bayanzag, the red cliffs, where deep time breaks the surface. Let's leave monasteries, ritual and sacred smoke behind and head west into the Gobi, where the land starts to look stripped down to its barest elements: rock wind distance and light. And there, in the southern Gobi Bayanzag, comes into view a landscape of heavily eroded red and orange cliffs that seem to rise out of the desert floor without warning. Britannica notes that Bayanzag is one of the southern Gobi's most important fossil regions, tied to the broader Gurvan-Saikan area. In other words, this is not just a scenic stop. It is one of the places that helped make Mongolia essential to the history of paleontology. At first glance, Bayanzag feels almost too stark to hold so much history. There are no trees to soften the horizon, no permanent water, no ruins announcing human drama. And yet, that is exactly what gives the place its force. The cliffs are quiet but not empty. In the 1920s, Roy Chapman Andrews of the American Museum of Natural History brought his Central Asiatic expeditions into the Gobi in search of major fossil discoveries. Then, in 1923, among what AMNH describes as the red-orange dunes of the Flaming Cliffs, a team member found the first recognized non-avian dinosaur eggs. That discovery alone changed the scientific importance of the site forever. Suddenly, Bayanzag was no longer just a remote desert landscape. It became one of the most famous fossil localities on Earth. And the story did not stop with eggs. AMNH also notes that Roy Chapman Andrews found a specimen of Oviraptor at the site, and beneath it was a nest of eggs. At the time, the animal was named for what scientists thought was egg stealing. Later researchers realized the dinosaur had actually been brooding its own nest. So, step by step, Bayanzag did something rare. It corrected the human imagination as much as it fed it. First came discovery. Then came reinterpretation. Then came a deeper understanding of how dinosaurs lived, nested, and cared for their young. So, when you stand here now, the experience works on two levels at once. Visually, it is all space and color. Dry gullies, broken walls of sandstone, and a silence that makes every footstep feel louder than it should. But intellectually, something else is happening. You are looking at a place where prehistoric life did not vanish into abstraction. It stayed in the ground waiting, and that is why Bayanzag matters so much in this story. After empire, religion, and memory, Mongolia now reveals another layer of itself, a land where even the desert holds evidence older than humanity itself. Karakorum, the capital, that once sat at the center of the world. And then, after the fossil beds of Bayanzag, the story shifts once more from prehistory to empire. We move back into the Orkhon Valley, a landscape UNESCO describes as one of the great crossroads of nomadic civilization, where political power, trade, religion, and movement shaped the heart of Inner Asia for centuries. It was here in 1220 that Chinggis Khan selected the site of Karakorum. And soon after, under his son Ögödei, that site was developed into the imperial capital of the Mongol world. For roughly 40 years, Karakorum functioned as the political center of the largest contiguous land empire in history. What matters, though, is not just that Karakorum was a capital. It is how different that capital was from the monumental cities many people imagine. This was not Rome. It was not Chang'an. It was not Constantinople. Karakorum rose out of a steep world, and even at its height it remained tied to the logic of mobility trade and imperial administration, rather than pure architectural grandeur. Still, it was far from simple. Britannica notes that Ogode enclosed the city with walls and built a rectangular palace supported by 64 wooden columns on granite bases. The city also contained brick buildings, religious structures, and stone tortoises that marked parts of the urban landscape's small surviving clues to a place that once received envoys, merchants, clerics, and officials from across Eurasia. And that, in many ways, is Karakorum's most fascinating quality. It was both a Mongol capital and an international city. UNESCO describes the Orkhon Valley as a link between East and West, and Karakorum embodied that role. Contemporary sources remembered it as a place where multiple faiths coexisted. Britannica records that the city once contained shamanistic shrines, 2 mosques, and a Nestorian church. Meanwhile, the University of Washington's Silk Road project notes that William of Rubruck, the first European known to visit Karakorum and return with a written account, described a cosmopolitan court filled with people of different ethnicities and religions. In other words, Karakorum was not isolated at the edge of the world. It was connected to the world in every direction. Yet, just as quickly, the center moved. In 1260, Kublai Khan shifted the imperial capital toward what is now Beijing, and Karakorum gradually lost its central role. Later invasions and destruction accelerated that decline, and the city was eventually abandoned, leaving behind ruins rather than a living metropolis. So today, standing in this open valley, you are not looking at a city that survived intact. You are looking at the outline of vanished authority. And precisely because so little remains, Karakorum feels more powerful, not less a reminder that even the strongest capitals can recede back into grasswind and memory. Erdene Zuu, faith rising from the ruins. And yet, the story does not end with Karakorum's silence. Just beside the remains of that imperial capital, another chapter took shape, quieter, more inward, but no less important. Erdene Zuu, founded in 1585, under Abtai Sain Khan, is widely regarded as the earliest surviving Buddhist monastery in Mongolia. It was built on the old Karakorum site, and stones from the ruined capital were reused in its construction, giving the monastery a physical link to the empire that came before it. What makes Erdene Zuu so compelling is the shift it represents. Karakorum had spoken the language of power diplomacy and conquest. Erdene Zuu speaks in another register prayer ritual continuity. Its enclosing wall, marked by 108 white stupas, a sacred number in Buddhism, turns the site into something both architectural and symbolic, a sacred boundary drawn across a former seat of the empire. So, in a way, this is Mongolia doing something remarkable with its own past. Rather than erasing one era to make room for another, it allowed the spiritual world to rise directly from the political one. And that is why Erdene Zuu feels so important, not simply as a monastery, but as proof that even after conquest fades, belief can still become the next lasting monument. The Orkhon Valley, where Mongolia's long memory still lives. And from Erdene Zuu, the view widens again. Not toward a single monument this time, but toward an entire landscape that seems to hold layer after layer of Mongolia's past. The Orkhon Valley Cultural Landscape, inscribed by UNESCO in 2004, stretches across 121,967 hectares along the Orkhon River and includes archaeological remains going back to the 6th century, as well as Karakorum, the old Mongol imperial capital. UNESCO describes it as a place where the links between nomadic pastoral life and administrative and religious centers can still be read directly in the land itself. And that is exactly what makes this valley so important. This is not just beautiful scenery. It is one of the great historical corridors of Central Asia, a place shaped by successive nomadic cultures and by centuries of political trade, cultural and religious activity linking East and West. Even now, the grassland is still used by Mongolian herders, which gives the valley a rare continuity. It is not simply preserved history, but lived history. And somewhere along that same river system, the land breaks into one more unforgettable image: Ulaanbaatar, the Orkhon waterfall, where the valley briefly turns from open pasture into cliff gorge and falling water. So, in a single region, Mongolia gives you empire faith migration, and nature all moving through the same ground. The JRA, home-built for movement, memory and weather. And then, after valleys, capitals and monasteries, we come back to the structure that may explain Mongolia better than anything else: the Jia. At first glance, it seems simple. a round dwelling of lattice walls, roof poles, felt canvas and ropes. But the Zuu is not simple at all. UNESCO recognizes the traditional craftsmanship of the Mongol Zuu as intangible cultural heritage, noting that it is light enough to carry, flexible enough to fold and pack, and sturdy enough to be dismantled and rebuilt again and again. In other words, it was designed for a civilization that did not stay still. And inside, every detail has order. Britannica notes that the door traditionally faces south. The north is the place of honor. The west is associated with men, the east with women. And the stove stands at the center, its chimney rising through the roof. So, the Zuu is not only practical, it is structured, symbolic, and deeply social. Even taking it down and putting it back up is traditionally a family act, with children learning by watching elders and entire communities sharing in the work of felt-making, stitching, and wood preparation. That is why the Zuu matters so much. It is not just shelter against wind and winter. It is a portable world carrying custom, hierarchy, craftsmanship, and family memory wherever the steppe calls people next. So, in the end, Mongolia is not a country that reveals itself all at once. It opens in stages. First through empire, then through ruin, then through prayer, water, grassland, and movement. One moment you are standing where the Mongol world once ruled continents. Next, you are watching smoke rise from a Zuu or wind move across an empty valley that still remembers every rider who passed through it. And that may be the most remarkable thing about this country. It never feels separated from its own past. History here is not locked away behind glass. It remains in the land, in the rhythms of herding, in sacred places, in seasonal travel, and in the quiet strength of people who still know how to live with distance, cold, and open sky. Mongolia does not need to speak loudly. Its presence is enough. And once you have seen it, it stays with you.